Hey guys, tonight we're going to delve into the silent corridors of palaces where mirrors reflect more than vanity. They reflect centuries of secrets buried in royal blood. You walk on cold marble floors where the most powerful women in the world once trod, but also the most imprisoned of their own lineage. Their ghosts whisper from the golden tapestries, telling stories of marriages that were both coronations and dooms. This history may solve mysteries you didn't even know you had about why some queens seemed destined for tragedy from birth, as if fate had been woven into their genes long before they breathed their first breath. So, before exploring history with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or perhaps leave a comment below, but be sure to do so when you really like what I'm bringing you. I'd love to know where and when you started watching this video, or just leave me a compliment if you're feeling generous tonight. Maybe you're snuggled up in your favourite bed, or perhaps you're on the couch with a soft blanket. Tell me about your nighttime ritual. Now, let's keep the lights as dim as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help make the story feel more poignant. And let's embark on tonight's journey together. You find yourself in Alexandria in the year 51 BC. The Mediterranean air carries the scent of myrrh and incense, mingled with the exotic perfume of gardens blooming under the Egyptian moon. But there's also something more subtle in the air, the weight of 3 centuries of tradition that is about to crown its latest guardian. The night wind whispers secrets between the marble columns as you walk toward the Grand Ptolemaic Palace, where an 18-year-old girl prepares for a ritual that has defined her dynasty since Alexander the Great conquered these golden lands and handed them over to his most loyal generals. Cleopatra VII. Philopator stands before a polished bronze mirror that reflects not only her face, but centuries of family history. Her eyes, which will soon captivate the most powerful men in Rome, reflect a fierce intelligence, but also the weight of a lineage that has remained pure for 300 years. You watch as her servants dress her in silks that look liquid in the torchlight, adorning her with jewels that have adorned Ptolemaic queens for generations. But what they cannot undress is the genetic reality that runs through her veins like a golden and dangerous river. She is the product of generations of marriages between siblings, uncles, and nieces, cousins who shared not only golden thrones, but gene pools so similar that their family trees resembled mirrors reflecting each other infinitely. The Ptolemies had turned inbreeding into an art as refined as their marble sculptures. From Ptolemy Thurston, Alexander's Macedonian general, who had proclaimed himself pharaoh and founded a dynasty that would last 3 centuries, to this latest descendant now donning her royal diadem. The family had followed Egyptian pharaonic traditions of sibling marriage with a dedication bordering on religious obsession. You can almost feel the echoes of past wedding ceremonies resonating in these same gilded columned halls, where brothers married sisters not for romantic love, but for the preservation of what they considered divine blood, as pure as the gold adorning their crowns. Conventional history tells us that the Ptolemies adopted this practice from native Egyptian pharaohs, who believed that royal blood was literally divine and should not be contaminated by lesser bloodlines. But here's a curious fact that few know. Papyrus records suggest that some members of the Ptolemaic family suffered from haemophilia, a condition that becomes more common in highly endogamous bloodlines. Imagine royal ceremonies where brides and grooms bled easily, considering their wounds signs of their divine nature when in fact they were symptoms of their compromised genetic heritage. But Cleopatra is different, and you sense it in the way she holds her chin with a confidence that seems to defy both the gods and genetics. Unlike many of her ancestors, who had succumbed to the physical and mental weaknesses that accompany severe inbreeding, she seems to have inherited the best of her lineage, a dagger-sharp intelligence, the political savvy of a wise serpent, and a presence that commanded respect before she uttered a single word. Historians still debate whether her fame beauty was physical, or if she simply possessed that special magnetism that only comes with absolute confidence in one's own divine power. You follow her as she heads to the temple for her nocturnal coronation, a Ptolemaic tradition that connected the pharaohs to the nocturnal mysteries of Isis. Her footsteps echo on the cold marble, each echo bringing her closer to a destiny that had been written in her DNA long before her first cry at birth. Torches cast dancing shadows on walls decorated with hieroglyphics telling the stories of her ancestors. Each symbol a reminder that she's not just the last of the Ptolemies, she's the final experiment of a dynasty that staked everything on blood purity. The irony washes over you like the salty Mediterranean breeze filtering through the palace windows. This woman, who had become the eternal symbol of feminine power in the ancient world, was also the living culmination of one of the most extreme inbreeding experiments in human history. Her parents had been siblings, her grandparents had been first cousins, and if you were to trace her family tree, you would discover that it resembled more a ladder than a tree with diverse branches. You now travel north, leaving behind the warm embrace of the Mediterranean to enter the cold mist of Castile, where the winds whisper tales of a queen whose name has become synonymous with madness. It is the year 1479, and you walk through the stone halls of Tordesillas Castle, where the echoes of hysterical laughter and inconsolable weeping mingle with the sound of chains dragging against the marble floor stained by royal tears. Joanna of Castile, cruelly known to history as Joanna the Mad, rocks in a carved chair by a window overlooking golden wheat fields. You watch her trembling hands as she caresses a portrait of her dead husband, Philip the Fair, whispering words of love to an image that can no longer answer her. But what you see is not simply a woman driven mad by grief. It is the inevitable product of generations of consanguineous marriages that had turned the House of Trastamara into a genetic labyrinth with no way out. The Trastamaras had begun their reign in Spain with noble ambitions. But like many royal dynasties, they soon discovered that maintaining power required keeping their blood pure. You can trace Joanna's madness through her family tree as if it were a map of a hereditary disease. Her great-grandmother, Maria de Padilla, had shown signs of mental instability. Her grandmother, Isabella of Portugal, had suffered bouts of melancholy so profound that she refused to leave her rooms for months at a time. Her mother, the famous Isabella the Catholic, had managed to control her own depressive tendencies through an ironclad religious faith. But the genetic price was accumulating like a debt that would eventually have to be repaid. Conventional history paints Joanna as a woman driven mad by love. But you uncover a more complex truth as you examine the medical records preserved in the Vatican archives. The symptoms chroniclers described as love sickness perfectly match what modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe bipolar disorder, a condition with strong genetic components that dramatically intensifies in inbred populations. Here's a fascinating piece of trivia that few historians mention. Joanna wasn't the only one in her family to display these symptoms. Her brother John, the Crown Prince, had displayed obsessive behaviours and bouts of rage that courtiers attributed to his royal temper. Her sister Catherine, who had become Henry VIII's first wife, suffered from bouts of depression so severe that she was often bedridden for weeks at a time, something her doctors described as the melancholy of royal blood. It was as if madness was the price the Trastamara family paid for their crown. Walk through Joanna's private chambers and you can feel the tragedy etched in the stones. The windows are covered with heavy curtains because the daylight agitated her, causing her to scream that the sun's rays were trying to steal Philip's soul from his portrait. Historians still debate whether her behaviour was genuinely psychotic or exaggerated by her political enemies to justify her imprisonment, but contemporary medical records suggest that her symptoms were very real and very severe. The most tragic thing about Joanna's story is that she was fully aware of her condition during her lucid moments. The archives contain letters she wrote to her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, pleading for his release, explaining with painful clarity that her bouts were temporary and that during her calm periods she was perfectly capable of governing. "Madness comes and goes like the tides," she wrote in a letter that was never sent, "but my love for Castile remains constant like the stars." Her personal tragedy became even crueler when we consider that her children inherited not only her throne, but also her genes. Charles V, her eldest son, struggled throughout his life with bouts of what his doctors called royal melancholy. a condition that led him to lock himself away in monasteries for months at a time, withdrawing from the responsibilities of governing the world's largest empire. Her daughter Catherine showed similar signs of emotional instability, creating a pattern that would be repeated in the House of Austria for generations. You notice a detail that reveals the depth of her tragedy. On her desk are dozens of unsent letters, all addressed to Philip, all written after her death. In them, Joanna not only expressed her undying love, but also discussed matters of state with a lucidity that completely contradicted her reputation for madness. It was as if her brilliant mind were trapped in a body that had inherited the accumulated defects of generations of inbreeding. The final irony of Joanna the Mad is that her madness may have been the sanest possible response to the impossible circumstances of her life, caught between her father's political ambitions, her husband's intrigues, and the genetic limitations of her heritage. Refuge in fantasy may have been her only form of emotional survival. Her psychotic episodes allowed her to temporarily escape a reality that had been designed to destroy her from the moment of her conception. As you drive away from Tordesillas, you can hear their wails floating on the night wind, an eternal reminder that the purity of royal blood often came with a price to pay in sanity, happiness, and ultimately the very humanity of those who possessed it. You now glide through the halls of mirrors at Versailles, where the light of 1,000 candles dances on gilded surfaces and creates shadows that seem to move with a life of their own. It is 1774 and the air is thick with the perfume of French roses and the subtlest scent of aristocratic fear. You walk, following the whisper of silks and the delicate clink of jewels, until you reach the private apartments where a 19-year-old queen gazes into an ornate mirror, unaware that she is gazing not only at her own reflection, but into the face of a doomed dynasty. Marie Antoinette of Austria adjusts a powdered wig that rises like a tower of lace and feathers, a fashion so extravagant it seems to defy both gravity and common sense. But you know that this superficial opulence hides a darker truth. She is the product of centuries of Habsburg marriages that have woven such a complex web of kinship that her family tree seems more like an impossible to untie knot. Her rosy cheeks and crystalline laugh hide the genes that have travelled across Europe for generations, accumulating mutations like a genetic snowball rolling downhill toward disaster. The Habsburgs had perfected the art of royal inbreeding to a science as precise as their Swiss watches. Since the 15th century, they had followed the family motto Bella gerant ali, to Felix Austrias nubi. Let others make war, you, fortunate Austria, marry. But what began as a brilliant political strategy had become a genetic trap, ensnaring each new generation in a maze of faulty DNA. You can trace Marie Antoinette's heritage like a detective following clues in a mystery novel. Her mother, Maria Theresa, was the daughter of first cousins. Her father, Francis I, descended from a line so inbred that he shared ancestors with his wife at least 6 different points in their family tree. Conventional history presents Marie Antoinette as a frivolous queen who lost her mind due to her extravagance. But you discover a more complex narrative as you examine the medical records preserved in the Austrian Imperial Archives. The symptoms that French court physicians described as delicate nerves and sensitive constitution match genetic patterns that modern scientists would recognize as direct consequences of severe inbreeding fertility problems, tendencies toward depression, and a physical fragility that required constant medical care. Here's a fascinating piece of trivia that rarely appears in history books. Marie Antoinette suffered from what her doctors called white discharge, a condition that was likely endometriosis, a disease with strong genetic components that occurs more frequently in inbred populations. This condition not only caused constant physical pain, but also made conception extremely difficult, creating intense political pressure on a queen whose primary job was to produce heirs for France. Her first 7 years of marriage were an ordeal of invasive medical treatments, special diets, and the constant humiliation of having her menstrual cycle monitored by court physicians as if it were a scientific experiment. You watch her undergo a morning preparation routine, a ritual that takes over 3 hours and requires the participation of dozens of maids. But beyond the apparent superficiality, you can see the subtle signs of her genetic heritage, the slightly asymmetrical shape of her jaw, inherited from generations of Habsburgs, the sickly pallor that requires layers of cosmetics to conceal, the hands that tremble slightly when she thinks no one is looking. A symptom modern doctors would recognize as possible evidence of minor neurological disorders related to inbreeding. Historians still debate whether Marie Antoinette actually uttered the famous phrase, "Let them eat cake," when she was informed that the people had no bread. But medical records reveal a more interesting truth: she suffered from episodes of what her doctors described as absences of mind. Periods during which she seemed disconnected from the reality around her. These episodes may have been minor seizures or dissociative symptoms, both conditions that appear more frequently in highly related individuals. Her personal tragedy intensifies when you consider that she was fully aware of her difference. In private letters to her sister, Maria Carolina, Queen of Naples, Marie Antoinette wrote of her inherited weaknesses and her fear that her children might inherit what she called the curse of our blood. It was a prophecy that would be fulfilled in ways she could never have imagined her son. Louis Charles, the Dauphin, would die young of tuberculosis, a disease that most severely attacks individuals with immune systems compromised by inbreeding. You walk through the gardens of Versailles, where Marie Antoinette played shepherdess in her artificial village, the Petit Trianon. This pastoral fantasy wasn't just an aristocratic whim. It was her way of escaping a reality that had been designed by generations of ancestors who valued blood purity over health, happiness, or even survival. In these gardens, carefully designed to appear natural, she could pretend to be a simple peasant, free from the genetic burdens that haunted her in the main palace. The ultimate irony of Marie Antoinette is that her execution during the French Revolution was seen by many as the just punishment for her extravagance. But the truth is more complex. She was both a victim and a symbol of a system that had sacrificed generations of human well-being on the altar of dynastic purity. Her head rolled not only from her own excesses, but from the accumulated genetic sins of centuries of ancestors who had chosen political power over biological health. As the night wind whispers through the perfectly pruned trees of Versailles, you can almost hear the echo of her laughter, now forever silenced, but which had once desperately tried to find joy in a world that had been designed to destroy her from the moment of her conception in the inbred palaces of Vienna. You step back in time, away from the broken mirrors of Versailles, to find yourself in the stone castles of 15th century Spain, where the scent of incense and parchment mingles with the distant echo of bells calling for mass. You walk through the corridors of the Alcazar of Segovia, where tapestries tell stories of conquest and reconquest, but also conceal the more complex narrative of a woman who would become legend while planting the seeds of genetic destruction for her own dynasty. Isabel of Castile kneels in her private chapel, her hands clasped in prayer as the light from golden candles dances across her serene face. At 23, she's already demonstrated an iron will that rivals that of any king of her time. But you know that behind that steely determination lies a paradox that would define not only her reign, but the fate of Europe. This woman, who would unify Spain and finance the discovery of America, would also perpetuate the marital traditions that would eventually destroy her descendants. The Trastamaras had risen to power through violence and cunning, but Isabel transformed their savage legacy into something that seemed divine. You can see in her eyes the absolute conviction that she was God's chosen instrument to restore Spain to greatness. But what she couldn't see was how her own genetic heritage already bore the marks of generations of consanguineous marriages that had characterized Iberian royal houses since the 12th century. Conventional history celebrates Isabella as the architect of modern Spain, the queen who expelled the Moors, financed Columbus, and laid the foundations of the Spanish Empire. But you discover a more nuanced narrative as you examine the genealogical records preserved in the Simancas archives. Isabella was the product of at least 3 generations of cousin marriages, and her own marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon would add another layer of consanguinity to an already compromised gene pool. Here's a curious fact rarely mentioned in official biographies. Isabella suffered from what contemporary chroniclers described as periodic fevers and sudden melancholies, symptoms that modern physicians would recognize as possible indicators of immune system disorders related to inbreeding. Her Arab physicians, the only ones who dared to honestly document these episodes, noticed that her symptoms followed hereditary patterns they had observed in other highly consanguineous royal families. You watch her review portraits of potential husbands for her children, and you can see how her marital decisions reveal the terrible irony of her legacy. Every choice she makes is guided by brilliant political, but genetically disastrous, considerations. Her daughter Isabella will be married to Afonso of Portugal, her second cousin. Her daughter Joanna will marry Philip of Burgundy, creating the union that would eventually produce the Spanish Habsburg line. Her son John will marry Margaret of Austria, strengthening the ties to the Holy Roman Empire but adding another layer of consanguinity to the genetic mix. Historians still debate whether Elizabeth was genuinely religious or simply using faith as a political tool, but the records of her confessor reveal a more complex truth. She suffered from bouts of severe anxiety that she interpreted as divine trials. Her sleepless nights, spent in obsessive prayer, may have been symptoms of minor neurological disorders related to her inbred heritage rather than manifestations of spiritual devotion. You walk through the hall where Elizabeth receives foreign ambassadors, and you can see how her commanding presence obscures subtle signs of the fragility that characterized her lineage. Her hands, which hold state documents with absolute authority, display an almost imperceptible tremor that her courtiers attributed to religious emotion, but was likely evidence of the neurological costs of generations of inbreeding. Elizabeth's tragedy becomes more evident when you consider that she was a deeply loving mother who had no idea that her marital choices would doom her children and grandchildren. Her private correspondence reveals a woman who suffered whenever her children fell ill, who spent entire nights watching by their bedsides, who consulted the best doctors in Europe, seeking cures for ailments she didn't know she had genetically inherited. Her son John, the heir to the throne, would die at the age of 19 from what doctors described as constitutional weakness, but which was likely the result of a compromised immune system due to inbreeding. Her daughter Isabella would die in Portugal after giving birth to a son who would live only 2 years. Her daughter Mary would suffer multiple miscarriages before finally producing an heir. Only Joanna would survive to adulthood, but she would pass on the genes for madness that would define the House of Austria for generations. You can see the ultimate irony as you watch Isabella working late into the night in her private chambers, surrounded by maps of the new world her explorers were discovering. This extraordinary woman, who was expanding the borders of the known world and establishing an empire that would last 3 centuries, was also sealing the genetic fate of a dynasty. Her brilliant political decisions were based on a sophisticated understanding of European diplomacy, but her marital choices followed medieval traditions that failed to take into account the biological cost of inbreeding. The wind blowing through the castle's open windows carries the scent of orange blossoms, a reminder of the eternal spring of Andalusia that Isabella had reconquered for Christendom. But it also carries something more subtle, the weight of decisions that would resonate through the centuries, creating a legacy that would be both glorious and tragic, both imperial and intimately human in its hereditary pain. You now cross the English Channel on a misty night, where grey waves crash against white cliffs that have witnessed centuries of invasions, royal marriages, and dynastic tragedies. The salty wind carries whispers of Greenwich, where you walk through the halls of a palace that still resonates with the echoes of marital arguments that would change the course of European religion forever. It is 1509 and you follow the whisper of Spanish silks to a room where a young 23-year-old princess prepares for a destiny that had been written in her blood long before she breathed her first English breath. Catherine of Aragon looks at herself in a Venetian mirror while her ladies-in-waiting adjust her velvet gown embroidered with gold threads that catch the light like tiny suns. Her face, which carries the serenity worthy of a Spanish infanta, hides a genetic truth that will be revealed in the years to come in the cruelest way possible. She carries the same inbred genes that had condemned her sister Joan to madness, and that would eventually destroy her own hopes of becoming the mother of English kings. Catherine's marriages reveal the cruel complexity of the European dynastic system. First, she was married to Arthur, Prince of Wales, in a ceremony uniting England and Spain in an alliance promising continental stability. But Arthur died just 5 months after the wedding, leaving Catherine in a political and emotional limbo that would last 6 years. You can feel the loneliness seeping through the stones of the palace as she waited. Technically a widow, but practically a prisoner, for politicians to decide her fate, as if she were a chess piece rather than a human being with a heart and soul. Her second marriage to Henry VIII began like a fairy tale, but you know it was doomed from the start for reasons beyond politics or personality. Medical records preserved in the Vatican archives reveal a story that contemporary chroniclers dared not fully tell. Catherine suffered from what her Spanish doctors had diagnosed as cold womb, a condition likely severe endometriosis, inherited through generations of consanguineous marriages in the Iberian royal houses. Here's a fascinating medical tidbit that few biographies mention. The detailed records of Catherine's pregnancies, kept by her confessors, reveal a devastating pattern of miscarriages that perfectly matches what modern geneticists would recognize as severe genetic incompatibility. Of 6 confirmed pregnancies, only 1 resulted in a child who survived beyond infancy. Mary, later known as Bloody Mary, who would inherit not only the throne but also the depressive tendencies and physical fragility that characterized her maternal lineage. As you walk through the Greenwich Gardens, where Catherine spent hours in contemplation, you can see how her deep Catholic faith deepened with each loss. Each miscarriage was interpreted by her confessors as a divine test. But the Moorish doctors who occasionally treated her in secret noticed patterns that suggested genetic rather than spiritual causes. Her private letters to her mother, Isabella the Catholic, reveal a woman who suffered not only physically, but also emotionally, wondering if she'd done anything to deserve this curse of infertility. Historians still debate whether King Henry VIII's famous Great Affair was really based on religious qualms about marrying his brother's widow, or whether it was simply a convenient excuse to get rid of a wife who could not produce male heirs. But medical records suggest a third, more subtle possibility. Henry may have developed an intuitive understanding that Catherine's reproductive problems were not temporary or curable, but fundamentally genetic. You observe Catherine during her final years in England, when she had already been repudiated and was living virtually in exile at Kimbolton Castle. Her chambers, once decorated with Spanish tapestries telling stories of the Reconquista, are now nearly empty, but she maintains her royal dignity with a determination that defies both her ex-husband and her genetic destiny. Her only companions are a few loyal Spanish ladies and her prayer books. But in the solitude of her late nights, you can see how she finally finds a peace that had eluded her entire married life. The deepest irony of Catherine's story is that her failure as queen consort led directly to the English Reformation, one of the most important events in European history. Her genetic inability to produce male heirs destroyed her marriage, but it also freed England from papal control and laid the groundwork for the eventual British Empire. It was as if her defective genes had been the accidental catalyst for a world-changing religious revolution. Her death in 1536 was officially attributed to a long illness, but descriptions of her final symptoms, severe abdominal pain, dramatic weight loss, and bouts of delirium suggest it may have been cancer, a disease that appears most often in individuals with high blood relations. Her last words, according to her ladies-in-waiting, were a prayer in Spanish asking for forgiveness for her sins of blood, a phrase that may have reflected an intuitive understanding that her personal tragedy had genetic roots. You walk away from Kimbolton Castle as the English fog envelops its towers, carrying you toward other European courts where other royal women face the same genetic curses. The wind blowing off the North Sea carries with it the scent of salt and the eternal sadness of a woman who had been so devout, so dignified, and so completely betrayed by the heritage that ran through her veins like a poisoned river of nobility. Now you navigate the misty canals of the Seine, where the towers of Notre Dame rise like stone fingers pointing towards a grey sky that seems to bear the weight of centuries of royal secrets. You walk through the halls of the Louvre, where the scent of candle wax mixes with the perfume of French lilies, and something more subtle the rarefied air of hereditary melancholy. It is 1615, and you follow the whisper of Austrian silks to the apartments, where a young queen of 24 fights against shadows she cannot name but recognises intimately, as if they had been lifelong companions. Anne of Austria sits by a window overlooking the royal gardens, embroidering a tapestry with golden threads while silent tears roll down her pale cheeks. As Queen Mother of France, she should be at the height of her political power, but you can see how she bears the weight of a depression that goes beyond personal circumstances. It is an inheritance as tangible as her crown jewels, passed down through generations of Habsburg marriages that had turned melancholy into a family trait as characteristic as the prominent lip that marked her dynasty. The Habsburgs had come to dominate Europe not only through strategic marriages, but also through the perpetuation of genetic traits that included both intellectual greatness and emotional fragility. Anne was the daughter of Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, a union that represented the 5th consecutive generation of marriages between cousins in the Habsburg line. You can trace her depressive heritage like a genealogist following a pattern. Her great-grandmother, Maria Manuela of Portugal, had died young after severe episodes of melancholy. Her grandmother, Anne of Austria, the 4th wife of Philip II, had suffered from what the court doctors described as perpetual black humours. Conventional history presents Anne as a relatively minor queen consort, overshadowed by the brilliance of her son Louis XIV. But you discover a more complex narrative as you examine her private letters preserved in the archives of the French National Library. Her descriptions of what she called the darkness that comes with the dawn perfectly match the symptoms of severe depression, a condition that 17th century doctors did not know how to treat except with bloodletting and prayers. Here is a fascinating medical curiosity that reveals the depth of her suffering. Anne kept a secret diary where she recorded her shadow days versus her light days, inadvertently creating one of the first detailed records of bipolar disorder in European royal literature. Her mood patterns followed such regular cycles that her ladies-in-waiting learned to predict when she would need to be completely alone versus when she could participate in court ceremonies. You observe her during her morning rituals, where the process of dressing her as a queen takes more than 2 hours, not only because of the complexity of French fashion, but because many mornings her hands trembled so much that she could not hold a cup of hot chocolate without help. Historians still debate whether these tremors were symptoms of anxiety or evidence of minor neurological conditions related to Habsburg inbreeding. But medical records suggest that she suffered from both. Her motherhood became a source of both joy and genetic terror. When she finally gave birth to the future Louis XIV after 22 years of marriage, she wrote in her diary, "God has blessed me with a son, but I fear the shadows he may have inherited from my blood." Her maternal intuition would prove prophetic. Louis XIV, despite his greatness as a king, struggled throughout his life with episodes of what his doctors called royal melancholy, especially after the deaths of his children and grandchildren. You walk through the gallery where Anne commissioned family portraits, and you can see how she tried to create a visual narrative of dynastic stability that completely contradicted her internal experience. In these portraits, she appears serene and majestic, surrounded by symbols of power and fertility, but her eyes carry a sadness that no artist could completely hide. It was as if she were posing for posterity while privately fighting against demons that had been painted into her genetic code by centuries of Habsburg intermarriage. Her correspondence with her sisters, especially with Maria Anna of Austria, who would marry her cousin, Philip IV of Spain, reveals a network of royal women who shared not only kinship but also similar patterns of emotional suffering. They wrote coded letters where they discussed their melancholy humours using metaphors of weather and seasons, creating a secret language to describe experiences that the medicine of their time could not explain or treat effectively. The deepest irony of Anne of Austria is that she raised the king who had become the ultimate symbol of European absolutism, but she did so while struggling against a condition that made her feel completely powerless over her own emotional well-being. Louis XIV learned about kingship watching his mother navigate not only political intrigue, but also psychological territories that were completely unmapped by 17th century science. During her final years, Anne found refuge in an increasingly intense religiosity, spending hours in prayer that her confessors interpreted as devotion, but that were probably also a form of meditation that provided temporary relief from her genetic anxiety. Her private chapel became a sanctuary where she could admit her vulnerabilities without compromising her public image as Queen Mother of France. You walk away from the Louvre as the bells of Notre Dame ring the evening hour, taking you towards other European palaces where other Habsburg women faced similar battles against inheritances that were both crown and curse, both privilege and genetic prison that they could not escape no matter how high their royal rank. You now descend the marble steps into the imperial crypts of Vienna, where the cold air carries the scent of eternal incense and the weight of centuries of Habsburg ambition. You walk through underground corridors where the echoes of your footsteps mingle with whispers of women who died too young, carrying genetic secrets they could never name. It is 1673 and you emerge into the gardens of the Hofburg, where a 13-year-old girl plays with porcelain dolls that will soon be replaced by responsibilities that will destroy her childhood and, eventually, her life. Margherita Theresa of Austria, Infanta of Spain and future Holy Roman Empress, runs through the gardens with a grace that seems to defy the laws of physics, but you can see in the delicacy of her movements the first signs of a fragility that had been bred into her bones through generations of Habsburg intermarriage. Her rosy cheeks and musical laughter hide a devastating genetic truth. She is the product of the union between her uncle and her niece, a combination that had concentrated the Habsburg defects to an almost experimental point. Velázquez's portraits had captured her ethereal beauty, but what they could not paint was the complex genetic map that ran through her veins like a river of tainted nobility. Her father, Philip IV of Spain, was the brother of her mother, Mariana of Austria, creating a level of consanguinity so extreme that modern geneticists would classify it as incestuous. You can trace her heritage like a detective following clues in a crime that had been committed against biology itself. Each shared ancestor increased the chances that she would inherit not just one copy of defective genes, but two identical copies that would amplify each other. Conventional history presents Margherita Theresa as a fairy tale princess who married Emperor Leopold I and lived happily ever after. But you discover a darker narrative as you examine the medical records preserved in the secret archives of the Vatican. Her symptoms, which the Austrian court doctors described as a delicate constitution, included episodes of extreme fatigue, bleeding episodes that suggested coagulation problems, and what her confessors called spells of absence that were probably minor seizures. Here is a medical curiosity that reveals the tragedy of her situation. Margherita Theresa was subject to one of the first documented cases of genetic counselling in European history. The Moorish doctors who served discreetly at the Spanish court had developed a primitive understanding of inheritance patterns and warned against her marriage to Leopold, who was also her first cousin. Their warnings were dismissed as superstition, but their predictions would prove tragically accurate. You observe her during her wedding ceremony in 1666, where she appears as a vision in white silk and diamonds, but you can see how her hands shake slightly as she holds the bouquet. Her 5 years of marriage would be a succession of pregnancies that ended in tragedy, 4 children born, but only one who would survive past infancy. Each loss was more devastating because both she and her doctors began to recognize patterns that suggested something fundamentally wrong with her reproductive system. Historians still debate whether her early death at the age of 22 was caused by complications of childbirth or by underlying genetic conditions. But the detailed records kept by her physicians suggest a combination of both. Her final pregnancy resulted in what modern medicine would recognize as postpartum sepsis, but her inability to recover suggests an immune system that had been compromised by generations of inbreeding. Her private correspondence with her younger sister, Marie Antonia, who would become Electress of Bavaria, reveals a young woman who was intellectually curious and emotionally sensitive, but also increasingly aware that something was wrong with her physical constitution. "I feel as if my body were made of glass," she wrote in a letter that was never sent. "Beautiful to look at, but ready to shatter at any moment." You walk through her private chambers in the Hofburg, where she had commissioned paintings of children that she hoped to have, optimistic visions that contrasted sharply with the reality of her genetic inheritance. These rooms, decorated with tapestries that depicted healthy, thriving families, became monuments to dreams that biology had made impossible to fulfill. The most profound irony of Margarita Theresa's story is that her marriage to Leopold I had been arranged not just for political reasons, but because both families believed that combining their pure bloodlines would result in children who would be even more noble and powerful than their parents. Instead, the marriage produced exactly the opposite children who were increasingly frail and susceptible to diseases that seemed to target royal families specifically. Her only surviving child, Maria Antonia, would carry forward the genetic legacy that Margarita Theresa had inherited, eventually passing it to her own children and perpetuating cycles of royal suffering that would continue for generations. It was as if each generation of Habsburg women were paying compound interest on a genetic debt that their ancestors had incurred centuries earlier. During her final illness, Margarita Theresa reportedly asked her confessor if God was punishing her family for some ancient sin. The question reveals an intuitive understanding that her suffering wasn't random, but part of something larger and more systematic. Her death became another entry in the long ledger of Habsburg women who had paid the ultimate price for their family's obsession with bloodline purity. You walk away from the Hofburg as the bells of St. Stephen's Cathedral ring vespers, carrying the sound across Vienna like a lament for all the royal children who had died too young, victims of genetic experiments disguised as dynastic marriages, sacrifices on the altar of an ideal of purity that had become indistinguishable from poison. You now glide through the whispering halls of the Escorial, where the granite shadows seem to guard secrets that not even confessors dare to whisper. You walk through corridors where the air is thick with the scent of frankincense and the more subtle weight of unspoken tragedies. It is 1683, and you follow the delicate echo of footsteps to a chamber where a young woman of 20 sits in almost complete darkness, surrounded by portraits of ancestors whose genetic legacy she carries like a curse disguised as nobility. Maria Antonia of Austria, Archduchess and younger sister of Marie Antoinette, exists in a shadow that history barely acknowledges, but you know that her story illuminates patterns that run through royal bloodlines, like underground rivers of genetic disaster. She is the product of the same Habsburg intermarriage that produced her more famous sister. But where Marie Antoinette had inherited enough genetic diversity to survive to adulthood, Maria Antonia carries the concentrated essence of centuries of consanguinity like a genetic time bomb ticking in her DNA. The records of her birth reveal a truth that the court physicians tried desperately to hide. She had been born with what they discreetly called irregularities of formation, physical abnormalities that modern genetics would recognize as classic signs of severe inbreeding. Her left arm was slightly shorter than her right, her spine curved in a way that required specially designed corsets, and her facial features, while still recognizably beautiful, showed the subtle asymmetries that marked her bloodline as surely as heraldic symbols marked her clothing. Conventional history barely mentions Maria Antonia because she died before reaching political significance. But you discover that her brief life provides a window into the everyday reality of living with a genetic inheritance that royal families preferred to ignore. Her private letters, preserved in secret archives of the Escorial Library, reveal a young woman who was painfully aware of her physical differences but struggle to understand why God had made her imperfect when her family claimed the divine right to rule. Here is a medical curiosity that demonstrates the systematic nature of Habsburg genetic problems. Maria Antonia suffered from what her doctors called bleeding sickness, a condition that modern medicine would diagnose as haemophilia. This wasn't a coincidence. The disease had been passing through European royal families for generations, hidden behind euphemisms like royal bleeding or noble frailty. Her menstrual periods were so severe that they often left her bedridden for days, and any small cut could become life-threatening. You observe her during her daily routines, where every activity had to be carefully planned around her physical limitations. She couldn't ride horses like other noble women, because minor falls could cause internal bleeding. She couldn't dance at court festivities because exertion triggered bleeding episodes. Even her religious devotions had to be modified. She couldn't kneel for extended periods because the pressure caused bruising that took weeks to heal. Historians still debate whether Maria Antonia's early death at the age of 23 was accidental, or if she deliberately sought to end her suffering. But the detailed records kept by her confessor suggest something more complex. She had developed a profound understanding that her genetic inheritance made a normal life impossible, and she gradually withdrew from activities that other people considered essential to living. Her correspondence with physicians across Europe, conducted in secret to avoid embarrassing her family, reveals a young woman who was surprisingly sophisticated in her understanding of inheritance patterns. She had noticed that marriages between closely related royals produced children with increasing rates of physical problems, and she had begun to question whether the practice of maintaining pure bloodlines was actually God's will or human vanity disguised as religious duty. You walk through her private chapel, where she spent increasing amounts of time during her final years, not just in prayer, but in what she called conversations with the saints about the nature of suffering. Her journal entries from this period show a mind that was grappling with profound theological questions about whether genetic inheritance could be considered divine will when it caused so much pain. The most profound tragedy of Maria Antonia's story is that she had begun to articulate ideas about marriage and genetics that wouldn't be officially recognized by science for another 2 centuries. In letters that she never sent, she suggested that royal families should consider marriages outside their immediate families to refresh their bloodlines, ideas that were considered heretical in an era when purity of blood was considered essential to political legitimacy. Her death occurred during what her physicians described as a bleeding episode of unprecedented severity, but the circumstances suggest that she may have been pregnant, a possibility that would have been both miraculous and devastating given her genetic condition. If true, it means she died attempting to give life while knowing that any child she bore would likely inherit her genetic burdens. Her final letter, addressed to her sister, Marie Antoinette, but never delivered, contains what may be one of the earliest explicit acknowledgements of genetic inheritance in royal correspondence. I fear that our family's greatest treasure, our pure blood, may also be our greatest curse. Each generation pays more dearly for the sins of purity committed by our ancestors. Maria Antonia's funeral was deliberately understated, but you can see in the faces of other Habsburg women who attended that they recognized themselves in her story. She had become a mirror in which they could see their own genetic destinies, a reminder that royal blood, no matter how pure, could not protect them from the biological consequences of centuries of family intermarriage. You walk away from the Escorial as evening shadows creep across the granite facades, carrying with them the whispered prayers of a young woman who had glimpsed a truth that her era wasn't ready to acknowledge, that sometimes the greatest acts of love require abandoning traditions that feel sacred, even when those traditions are destroying the people they're meant to protect. You now sail north, following trade routes that connect Spain with the territories of the Holy Roman Empire, until you reach the misty mountains of Austria, where ancient castles rise like stone guardians protecting secrets that echo through the centuries. You walk through the courtyard of the Innsbruck Palace, where morning fog clings to Gothic towers like veils of mourning that never quite lift. It is 1526, and you follow whispered conversations in Spanish to private chambers where a young woman of 21 prepares for the destiny that will define her as both empress and victim of a genetic inheritance that runs deeper than royal protocol. Isabella of Portugal looks at herself in a polished silver mirror while her Portuguese ladies adjust a dress that sparkles with threads of gold. But you can see in her reflection something that goes beyond mere nervousness about marrying the most powerful man in Europe. Her eyes carry a sadness that seems older than her years, as if she already senses that her marriage to Charles V will be both the pinnacle of her political value and the beginning of personal struggles that she cannot yet name but that run in her bloodline like underground rivers of genetic predisposition. The Portuguese royal family had maintained its own traditions of strategic intermarriage, but unlike the extreme endogamy of the Habsburgs, they had occasionally introduced fresh blood from Morocco and other parts of Africa, creating a genetic diversity that was both their secret strength and their public shame in an era when racial purity was considered essential to royal legitimacy. Isabella carries this mixed heritage as a hidden asset. Her immune system is stronger, her reproductive capacity more robust, but also as a source of anxiety because she knows that some members of Charles's court whisper about her exotic bloodline. Conventional history presents Isabella as the perfect wife for Charles V, beautiful, pious, politically useful, but you discover a more complex narrative as you examine correspondence between Portuguese and Spanish court physicians. They had conducted what amounted to a genetic analysis, comparing family medical histories to predict whether Isabella would be compatible with Charles's Habsburg inheritance. Their conclusion was optimistic. Her genetic diversity might actually complement his concentrated bloodline, potentially producing healthier children than pure Habsburg unions typically created. Here is a medical curiosity that reveals the sophistication of Renaissance court medicine. Isabella's physicians in Portugal had maintained detailed records of her menstrual cycles, general health, and even psychological temperament for almost a decade before her marriage, creating what was essentially the first documented attempt at genetic counselling in European royal history. They had noted that women in her maternal line rarely suffered from the melancholy sickness that plagued many royal families, suggesting that her genes might provide resistance to Habsburg depression. You observe her during her wedding ceremony, where she appears radiantly healthy compared to many of her Habsburg relatives who attend the celebration. Her posture is straight, her skin clear, her movements graceful but also strong. Physical signs that she has inherited protective genes that will serve her well during the demanding years ahead as empress. But you also notice subtle signs that she's aware of the genetic burden she's entering her prayers during the ceremony, include specific requests for healthy children, suggesting that she's been briefed about the reproductive challenges that face Habsburg women. Historians still debate whether Isabella truly loved Charles, or if their marriage was purely political, but her private letters reveal a relationship that became genuinely affectionate despite its arranged nature. More importantly, they show that Isabella developed a sophisticated understanding of her role not just as empress, but as a genetic guardian of the Habsburg legacy. She approached motherhood with strategic intelligence, consulting physicians across Europe about optimal timing, nutrition, and medical care to maximize the chances of healthy pregnancies. Her success as a mother becomes even more remarkable when you consider the genetic odds stacked against her. She produced 3 surviving children, including Philip II, who would become one of Spain's greatest kings, and none of them showed the obvious physical deformities or mental instabilities that characterized many Habsburg children of this era. Her genetic contribution essentially reset the Habsburg bloodline, providing a generation of relative health before subsequent intermarriages began concentrating defects again. You walk through the gardens where Isabella spent hours walking for exercise during her pregnancies, following medical advice that was remarkably advanced for its time. She had learned that physical activity, proper nutrition, and avoiding stress could improve pregnancy outcomes, knowledge that she documented in letters to other royal women, creating what amounted to a primitive prenatal care manual that circulated secretly among European courts. The irony of Isabella's story is that her greatest gift to the Habsburg dynasty healthy children, came precisely because she was not fully Habsburg herself. Her Portuguese Moorish ancestry provided a genetic diversity that strengthened her offspring, but this same diversity was considered somewhat scandalous by courtiers who prized bloodline purity above all else. She had to balance being genetically beneficial while appearing genealogically acceptable. Her correspondence with her sister-in-law, Catherine of Austria, reveals conversations about what they discreetly called bloodline management, discussions about whether royal families should consider marriages that prioritize genetic health over political advantage. These conversations were dangerous because they questioned fundamental assumptions about divine right and bloodline superiority. But they also show that some royal women were beginning to understand that their family's obsession with purity might be creating more problems than it solved. During her later years as a widow, Isabella became an informal consultant for other royal women facing reproductive challenges. Her advice, preserved in coded correspondence, emphasized the importance of introducing genetic diversity whenever possible, even if it meant marrying slightly below one's traditional standards. These letters provide a window into how some royal women began to think differently about genetics decades before formal science caught up with their intuitive understanding. Her death in 1539 was mourned not just because she was beloved, but because courtiers had begun to recognize that her genetic contribution had been extraordinary. Her children were healthier, more intelligent, and more physically robust than most Habsburg offspring, leading some to whisper that royal bloodlines might benefit from occasional refreshing with genetically diverse partners, an idea that would remain controversial for centuries but that Isabella had proven correct through her own life. You walk away from the Innsbruck Palace as alpine winds carry the scent of mountain flowers, remembering a woman who had served her dynasty not just through political loyalty, but through a genetic wisdom that she possessed intuitively and applied strategically. Even in an era when such concepts couldn't be officially acknowledged or scientifically explained, you now return to the austere corridors of the Alcazar of Madrid, where shadows seem heavier and the air carries an oppressive quality that goes beyond the typical formality of Spanish court life. You walk through rooms that echo with whispers of regency decisions and political manoeuvring, but also with something more intimate and tragic, the sound of a woman trying to govern an empire while battling demons that had been bred into her bloodline for generations. It is 1665 and you follow the rustle of black silk to private chambers, where a queen mother of 46 rules not just Spain, but also struggles against the genetic inheritance that threatens to destroy everything she tries to protect. Mariana of Austria sits in complete stillness at her writing desk, but you can see that even her moments of apparent calm are filled with tension. As Queen Mother and Regent for her young son Charles II, she carries the weight of governing the most powerful empire in the world, but also carries something more personal and devastating, the knowledge that her son, the future king, shows clear signs of the genetic deterioration that had been accumulating in the Habsburg bloodline for almost 2 centuries. Her hands, perfectly still as she writes state documents, occasionally tremble in a way that suggests she's fighting against impulses that she cannot completely control. The marriage between Mariana and her uncle Philipthor had been one of the most endogamous unions in Habsburg history. She was literally his niece, and their union concentrated Habsburg genes to a degree that modern geneticists would classify as extremely hazardous. You can trace the mathematical progression of genetic disaster. Each shared ancestor doubled the probability that any genetic defects would be expressed in their offspring. And Charles II would inherit not just one copy of problematic genes, but often 2 identical copies that amplified each other's effects. Conventional history portrays Mariana as a competent but unremarkable regent, but you discover a more complex truth as you examine secret correspondence between her personal physicians and papal authorities. Her letters reveal a woman who was painfully aware that something was fundamentally wrong with her family's bloodline, but also trapped by political circumstances that made it impossible to acknowledge these problems publicly or take meaningful action to address them. Here is a medical detail that illuminates the systematic nature of Habsburg genetic problems. Mariana herself suffered from what court physicians discreetly called royal epilepsy, a condition that manifested as brief seizures that she learned to hide through careful timing of public appearances and strategic use of private chambers. Her seizures followed patterns that modern medicine would recognize as classic absence epilepsy, likely caused by the same genetic factors that produced more severe symptoms in her son. You observe her during her daily routine of governing, where she must balance running an empire with managing her own health issues and monitoring her son's increasingly obvious disabilities. Charles II, even as a young child, showed signs that terrified everyone who saw him. His jaw was so severely malformed that he couldn't chew solid food properly. His tongue was too large for his mouth, and he suffered from seizures that were far more severe than his mother's discrete episodes. Historians still debate whether Mariana understood the genetic basis of her family's problems, but her private diary, written in a code that wasn't deciphered until the 20th century, contains entries that suggest she had developed a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of inheritance patterns. She wrote about the sins of our ancestors visiting themselves upon our children, and wondered whether God's will might actually require breaking family traditions that had become more curse than blessing. Her correspondence with other European royal families reveals a woman who was quietly investigating alternatives to traditional Habsburg marriage practices. She discreetly inquired about the health records of various potential marriage partners for her son, focusing not just on political advantages but on what she called constitution strength, essentially conducting primitive genetic screening centuries before such concepts existed officially. You walk through the throne room where Mariana conducted state business, but you can see that the real drama of her life played out in more private spaces. Her personal chapel had been modified with special cushions because prolonged kneeling triggered her seizures. Her dining room featured foods that could be eaten easily because she had learned that certain textures could trigger episodes. Even her bedroom had been arranged to minimize injury if she had seizures during sleep. The most profound tragedy of Mariana's regency was that she was attempting to govern rationally while dealing with an irrational genetic inheritance that affected both her own mental clarity and her son's capacity to rule. Her political decisions had to account not just for Spain's strategic interests, but also for the medical reality that the Habsburg line was approaching genetic collapse. She was essentially managing the decline of a dynasty, while trying to prevent that decline from destroying the empire itself. Her relationship with Charles II reveals the heartbreak of a mother who loves her child, but also recognizes that he represents the culmination of genetic mistakes that stretch back for generations. Her letters to him are filled with advice about managing his seizures, disguising his physical deformities during public appearances, and finding ways to rule effectively despite his cognitive limitations. They read like instruction manuals for surviving a genetic inheritance that no one wanted to acknowledge publicly. During her final years as regent, Mariana became increasingly religious, but not in a way that suggested simple piety. Her confessions, preserved in Vatican archives, reveal that she believed her family was being punished for marrying too closely to ourselves, and that redemption might require admitting our mistakes and choosing differently. These were dangerous thoughts for a regent whose legitimacy depended on maintaining the fiction that royal bloodlines were divinely blessed. Her death in 1696 marked the end of not just a regency, but an era of Habsburg attempts to maintain genetic purity in the face of mounting evidence that such purity was destroying them. Charles II would continue to rule for several more years, but his obvious genetic problems and inability to produce heirs meant that the Spanish Habsburg line was essentially already extinct. Mariana had spent her life trying to manage an empire while managing the slow-motion genetic collapse of the dynasty that created it. You walk away from the Alcazar as evening shadows lengthen across the courtyards, carrying the weight of understanding that sometimes the greatest acts of leadership require acknowledging when traditions that seem sacred have actually become dangerous, even when such acknowledgement threatens the very foundations of power itself. You now descend into the dark crypts beneath the Capuchin monastery in Vienna, where the scent of embalming spices mingles with something more elusive, the genetic echo of lives that were cut short by inheritance patterns that seem designed by fate to create tragedy. You walk among stone sarcophagi until you find the modest tomb of a young woman whose brief life illuminates the devastating mathematics of Habsburg endogamy. It is 1684, and although Anna Mauritia of Austria died at barely 19 years old, her story provides a window into how genetic destruction was accelerating through European royal families like an avalanche gaining momentum with each generation. Anna Mauritia had been born into what should have been privilege beyond imagination, daughter of Emperor Leopold II and his first wife, Margherita Theresa, making her the product of a union between uncle and niece that represented the mathematical extreme of Habsburg consanguinity. You can calculate her genetic burden like a scientist working backwards from tragedy. Her parents shared so many ancestors that her DNA essentially formed patterns that geneticists would classify as incestuous inheritance, creating biological instabilities that no amount of royal physicians could overcome. The records of her birth, preserved in the secret archives of the imperial court, reveal a truth that was hidden from public view. Anna Mauritia had been born with multiple congenital abnormalities that the court physicians struggled to treat using medieval medical knowledge. Her heart had structural defects that made her vulnerable to infections. Her immune system was so compromised that minor illnesses became life-threatening, and her skeletal development was abnormal in ways that required constant medical intervention throughout her short life. Conventional history barely mentions Anna Mauritia because her life was so brief and her disability so severe that she never played a public role. But you discover that her medical records provide a detailed case study of how extreme endogamy affects human development. Her physicians, some of the most advanced in Europe, documented her condition with a scientific precision that reveals patterns that wouldn't be understood officially until the development of modern genetics centuries later. Here is a medical curiosity that demonstrates the systematic nature of Habsburg genetic problems Anna Mauritia suffered from what her doctors called glass bone disease, a condition that modern medicine would diagnose as osteogenesis imperfecta. This genetic disorder, which causes extremely fragile bones, appears almost exclusively in populations with high levels of consanguinity. Her skeleton was so fragile that she suffered multiple fractures during normal activities, like walking or even being lifted by her nursemaids. You imagine her daily life, confined to specially padded rooms, where even gentle movements had to be carefully controlled to prevent injury. Her childhood had no running, no playing, no normal physical development, just endless medical treatments and careful management of a body that seemed designed to self-destruct. Yet court records also reveal that her mind was sharp and her spirit remarkably resilient, suggesting that even as her body failed, her personality retained the intellectual gifts that characterized the best of the Habsburg inheritance. Historians still debate whether Anna Mauritia's parents understood the connection between their close relationship and their daughter's severe disabilities, but private letters between Leopold and various court physicians suggest that they were beginning to suspect patterns that they couldn't quite articulate. References to bloodline weakening and discussions about possibly arranging marriages with healthier foreign houses indicate a growing awareness that something was fundamentally wrong with Habsburg genetic practices. Her medical treatment reveals the intersection between primitive genetics and religious belief that characterized 17th century medicine. Her physicians tried everything from bloodletting to herbal remedies to religious relics, but they also began documenting family medical histories with unprecedented detail, essentially conducting early genetic research, disguised as a religious investigation into divine punishment for family sins. You examine the portraits that were commissioned during her brief life, and you can see how court artists struggled to depict a child whose physical deformities were obvious, but politically impossible to acknowledge. The paintings show an ethereally beautiful girl with slightly otherworldly features, but close examination reveals subtle distortions that reflect her underlying genetic conditions, asymmetrical facial features, abnormally delicate bone structure, and eyes that seem both intelligent and haunted by a physical pain that no child should have to endure. Her correspondence with her half-sister Maria Antonia reveals a relationship that was both tender and tragic. Anna Mauritia wrote letters in a childish hand about her dreams of someday being strong enough to dance at court balls, to ride horses, to have children of her own, aspirations that her physicians knew were medically impossible, but that her family couldn't bear to discourage. These letters provide heartbreaking evidence of how genetic inheritance can trap children in bodies that betray their spirits. The most profound irony of Anna Mauritia's story is that her death actually provided valuable medical evidence that would influence Habsburg marriage policies for the next generation. Her autopsy, conducted discreetly by imperial physicians, revealed internal abnormalities that were so systematic and comprehensive that even 17th century doctors began to suspect a genetic causation rather than random divine punishment. The detailed anatomical drawings created during her autopsy essentially became a primitive genetic map that helped identify patterns of inheritance that the family could no longer ignore. Her funeral was deliberately private, but the guest list reveals that other European royal families were beginning to pay attention to Habsburg genetic problems. Representatives from France, England, and Portugal attended not just to pay respects, but to gather information about what they discreetly referred to as bloodline complications that might affect their own marriage negotiations with Habsburg partners. During the months following her death, court physicians across Europe began corresponding about what they called the Vienna pattern, a tendency for Habsburg children to die young from combinations of medical problems that seemed to cluster together in ways that suggested a common causation. These letters, written in medical Latin to avoid political scrutiny, essentially constituted the first international genetic research network. Centuries before such concepts existed officially, her personal belongings, preserved in museum collections today, tell a story of a life lived entirely within medical constraints. Her dolls were specially designed to be unbreakable. Her books were printed on soft paper that wouldn't cut her if she fell while reading. Her clothing was padded to protect her fragile bones from everyday impacts. Every object in her possession had been modified to accommodate a genetic fragility that made a normal childhood impossible. You find among her papers a letter she'd begun writing to future Habsburg children, a document that was never finished, but that reveals her intuitive understanding that her suffering was part of something larger than individual misfortune. "I pray that someday our family will choose love over bloodline," she'd written in her careful script, "because keeping blood pure seems to make bodies impure, and God surely wants us to be healthy more than he wants us to be royal." Anna Mauritia's brief life had become a genetic warning that the Habsburg family could no longer completely ignore. Her death prompted the first official discussions about whether certain types of family marriages should be avoided, conversations that would eventually lead to gradual changes in Habsburg marriage policies, though not before several more generations of children would pay similar prices for their ancestors' obsession with bloodline purity. As evening shadows creep across the monastery, you can almost hear the echo of a young voice asking questions that her era couldn't answer. Why did God make some royal children sick? Why did family love sometimes create family suffering? Why did the blood that was supposed to make them special also make them fragile? Her questions would remain unanswered during her lifetime, but they planted seeds of doubt that would eventually grow into a genetic understanding centuries later. You walk away from her tomb as the monastery bells ring vespers, carrying the memory of a child whose suffering had served as an unwitting sacrifice to genetic science. Her brief life providing evidence that would eventually help other royal families make better choices about love, marriage, and the true meaning of protecting those we care about most. You now emerge from the underground crypts into the golden light of Vienna's afternoon sun, but you carry with you the weight of a genetic knowledge that makes the beautiful Baroque architecture seem fragile, as if these elegant buildings were constructed on foundations that could collapse without warning. You walk towards the Hofburg Palace, where the afternoon shadows create patterns that shift and change, much like the political fortunes of a dynasty that was about to face its ultimate genetic reckoning. It is 1740, and you follow the sound of determined footsteps to a throne room where a woman of 22 prepares to inherit not just an empire, but also the accumulated genetic burden of 8 generations of Habsburg endogamy. Maria Theresa of Austria sits at her father's desk, reviewing documents that will transfer power from the Spanish Habsburg line, which had finally died out with Charles II, to the Austrian branch that she represents. But you can see in her posture something that goes beyond normal anxiety about inheriting vast political responsibilities. She carries the visible markers of Habsburg genetic inheritance, the prominent lower jaw, the slightly asymmetrical facial features, the nerve energy that suggests underlying neurological sensitivities that had been passed down through generations of family intermarriage. The Habsburg family had finally been forced to confront the mathematical reality of their genetic practices when Charles II died childless in 1700, ending the Spanish line entirely. His death hadn't been unexpected. He had suffered from seizures, mental disabilities, and physical deformities so severe that European courts had been quietly preparing for the Spanish succession for decades. But his genetic legacy served as a wake-up call that even the most politically conservative royal families could no longer ignore. Extreme endogamy was literally destroying the dynasties that practiced it. Conventional history presents Maria Theresa as a great empress who modernized the Austrian Empire and fought successfully against Frederick the Great. But you discover a more complex narrative as you examine her private medical records and family correspondence. She was acutely aware that she represented possibly the last generation of Habsburgs who could successfully reproduce, and her approach to marriage and motherhood reflected a sophisticated understanding of genetic inheritance that was centuries ahead of official scientific knowledge. Here is a medical curiosity that reveals her genetic awareness. Maria Theresa conducted what amounted to the first systematic genetic screening program in European royal history. Before arranging marriages for her children, she ordered detailed investigations into the medical histories of potential partners, focusing specifically on what she called bloodline health, rather than just political advantage. Her correspondence with physicians across Europe essentially created an international network for evaluating genetic compatibility that wouldn't be officially recognized by science for another 2 centuries. You observe her during her daily routine of governance, where she must balance running an empire with managing her own health issues that were clearly related to her Habsburg inheritance. She suffered from what her physicians called royal headaches, severe migraines that modern medicine would recognize as possibly related to the same neurological factors that cause seizures in other family members. Her treatment regimen included dietary restrictions and lifestyle modifications that suggest she understood the connections between genetics, brain function, and overall health. Historians still debate whether Maria Theresa's marriage to Francis Stephen of Lorraine was purely political, or if genetic considerations played a role. But the evidence suggests that she deliberately chose a partner whose family history showed no significant medical problems and whose bloodline was genetically distant from her own. Their children, while still carrying some Habsburg traits, were notably healthier than previous generations of Habsburg offspring, suggesting that her intuitive genetic strategy was successful. Her motherhood reveals a woman who was determined to break the cycles of genetic suffering that had characterized her family for generations. She personally supervised the medical care of her children, consulted physicians from across Europe about optimal nutrition and development, and most importantly, approached their marriage arrangements with genetic health as a primary consideration alongside political advantage. Her decisions about which children to marry to whom reveal a systematic attempt to introduce genetic diversity into the Habsburg bloodlines. You walk through the nursery wings of the Hofburg, where Maria Theresa had implemented what amounted to an early childhood development program designed to identify and address potential genetic problems before they became severe. Her children received medical monitoring that was unprecedented in royal history, with detailed records of their physical development, mental capabilities, and any signs of the neurological or physical problems that had plagued previous Habsburg generations. The irony of Maria Theresa's situation was that her political success came partly because she had been forced to acknowledge genetic realities that her predecessors had ignored. Her empire survived and thrived because she had begun to prioritize genetic health over bloodline purity. even though she couldn't publicly articulate this strategy without undermining the traditional justifications for royal authority that were based on concepts of superior bloodlines. Her correspondence with her daughter, Marie Antoinette, reveals a mother who was trying to prepare her child for marriage into the French royal family, while also warning her about genetic risks that she couldn't explain directly. Her letters are filled with coded advice about choosing healthy partners, avoiding certain types of family marriages, and prioritizing the health of future children over political considerations, guidance that Marie Antoinette would tragically fail to follow completely. During her later years, Maria Theresa became an informal advisor to other European royal families about what she discreetly called bloodline management. Her influence helped gradually shift European royal marriage practices away from extreme endogamy toward arrangements that balanced political advantage with genetic health, though these changes occurred slowly and often without explicit acknowledgement of their genetic rationale. Her death in 1780 marked the end of an era when Habsburg genetic problems could be ignored or explained away as divine will. Her successors would inherit not just her political reforms, but also her genetic legacy, a bloodline that had been partially refreshed through her strategic marriage choices, providing a foundation of relative health that would allow the Habsburg dynasty to continue for several more generations before finally ending in the 20th century. You walk away from the Hofburg as the afternoon light fades into evening, carrying the understanding that sometimes the greatest acts of leadership require acknowledging truths that threaten the very foundations of power, and that the courage to change ancient practices may be the only way to preserve what's truly valuable about the traditions we inherit from those who came before us. You now cross the Pyrenees under a sky that threatens a storm, following mountain roads that connect Austria with the troubled kingdoms of Iberia, where political upheaval and genetic inheritance intersect in ways that create perfect storms of human tragedy. You walk through the corridors of the Royal Palace of Madrid, where the air feels thick with political intrigue and something more personal, the scent of mental illness that has been passed down through bloodlines like an unwelcome inheritance that no amount of royal privilege can cure. It is 1788, and you follow whispered conversations to private chambers, where a princess of 38 struggles against demons that were bred into her bloodline centuries before her birth. Carlota Joaquina de Borbon, Infanta of Spain and future Queen of Portugal, paces restlessly in a room that has been specially modified to prevent self-injury during her increasingly frequent episodes of what court physicians discreetly call royal madness. You can see in her movements the same nervous energy that had characterized her ancestor Juana la Loca, but amplified by additional generations of genetic accumulation that had made mental instability almost inevitable in certain branches of the Spanish royal family. Her hands shake with a tremor that she tries to hide behind fans and gloves, and her eyes dart constantly toward shadows that may or may not exist outside her own mind. The Bourbon dynasty had replaced the Habsburgs in Spain during the War of the Spanish Succession, but they had made the crucial mistake of immediately marrying back into the same genetically compromised bloodlines that had destroyed their predecessors. Carlota Joaquina was the product of repeated marriages between Spanish Bourbons and Austrian Habsburgs, essentially recreating the same genetic problems that had made Charles II incapable of ruling effectively. Her genealogy reads like a genetic disaster blueprint concentrated inheritance from multiple lines that had been practicing endogamy for centuries. Conventional history presents Carlota Joaquina as a minor royal, whose political influence was limited to Portuguese court intrigue. But you discover a more tragic narrative as you examine psychiatric records that were kept secretly by court physicians. Her condition, which manifested as alternating periods of manic energy and profound depression, fits perfectly with modern diagnostic criteria for bipolar disorder, a condition that has strong genetic components and that appears with higher frequency in populations that have experienced prolonged inbreeding. Here is a medical detail that illuminates the progression of genetic mental illness in royal families. Carlota Joaquina's episodes followed patterns that were documented in her grandmother, great-grandmother, and several aunts. creating what amounted to a family pedigree of psychiatric illness that court physicians began to recognize as hereditary rather than coincidental. Her medical records include some of the earliest attempts at genetic counseling, as physicians tried to predict which of her children might inherit her condition and how severe their symptoms might become. You observe her during one of her good days, when her mental clarity allows her to participate in court functions, and you can see the intelligence and charisma that made her politically formidable when her illness was under control, but you also notice the constant vigilance of her attendants, who had learned to recognize the early signs of episodes that could turn violent or self-destructive without warning. Her life had become a carefully managed balance between public appearances and private medical management that exhausted everyone around her. Historians still debate whether Carlota Joaquina's political intrigues were motivated by rational calculation or by manic episodes that drove her to make increasingly erratic decisions. But her personal correspondence reveals a woman who was painfully aware of her mental instability and tried desperately to time her political activities during periods when she felt most mentally stable. Her letters include detailed descriptions of her symptoms that read like early psychiatric case studies. Her marriage to João of Portugal had been arranged partly because Portuguese physicians believed that their royal bloodline might provide a genetic balance for Spanish mental instability. But the strategy backfired because the Portuguese royalty had their own history of endogamous marriages that had created different but equally serious genetic problems. Their children inherited combinations of mental illness from both parents, creating some of the most severe psychiatric cases in European royal history. You walk through the gardens where Carlota Joaquina spent hours during her manic episodes, sometimes laughing hysterically at jokes that only she could hear, sometimes weeping inconsolably over tragedies that existed only in her mind. Her gardeners had learned to remove anything that could be used for self-harm during her worst periods, and her favourite walking paths had been modified to prevent her from wandering off during episodes of disorientation that could last for days. The most profound tragedy of Carlota Joaquina's story was that she had inherited not just mental illness, but also a sharp intelligence that made her fully aware of her condition during her periods of lucidity. Her private diary, written in a code that wasn't deciphered until modern times, contains heartbreaking entries about her fear that she was becoming like my grandmother, who died mad in a castle, talking to people who weren't there. She had developed a sophisticated understanding of her own psychology, decades before psychiatry existed as a formal medical discipline. Her relationship with her children reveals the double burden of royal motherhood when mental illness runs in the family. She loved them desperately, but also feared them, knowing that some of them would inherit her condition but unable to predict which ones or how severely they would be affected. Her letters to them are filled with advice about recognizing early symptoms, managing stress, and finding reliable medical support, essentially creating a family manual for surviving genetic mental illness. During her final years, Carlota Joaquina became increasingly isolated as her episodes grew more frequent and severe. Portuguese court records describe a woman who alternated between periods of brilliant political insight and complete psychological collapse. Often within the same day, her physicians documented her condition with a scientific precision that reveals how much European medicine had learned about mental illness through bitter experience with royal families who couldn't hide their genetic inheritance behind closed doors. Her death in 1830 was officially attributed to brain fever, but the symptoms described by her physicians suggest that she may have suffered from complications related to long-term psychiatric medication or possibly suicide during a particularly severe depressive episode. Her final words, according to her confessor, were a prayer asking God to forgive her ancestors for mixing our blood too closely and cursing their children with madness. You walk away from the palace as storm clouds gather over Madrid, carrying with you the understanding that mental illness in royal families wasn't just an individual tragedy, but a collective consequence of genetic decisions made by previous generations who valued political purity over psychological health, creating inheritance patterns that would affect their descendants for centuries to come. You now travel to the north of Spain, where the Cantabrian winds carry the salt spray of the Bay of Biscay, and something more ethereal whispers of a love story that was destined to become a tragedy before it even began. You walk through the elegant corridors of the Royal Palace of Madrid during a brief autumn in 1878 when political tensions and genetic inheritance conspired to create what would become one of the most heartbreaking examples of how royal blood, no matter how carefully preserved, could not protect against the biological consequences of centuries of endogamous marriage practices. Mercedes de Orléans y Bourbon stands at a window overlooking gardens that bloom with late roses, their beauty made more poignant by the approaching winter that will soon claim them. At barely 17 years old, she embodies everything that the Spanish people had hoped for in a queen beauty: grace, intelligence, and most importantly, a genuine affection for the young King Alfonso XIII, who had chosen her as his bride against considerable political opposition. But you can see in her delicate features the subtle signs of a genetic fragility that had been accumulating in European royal bloodlines for generations, markers that no amount of happiness could overcome. The Orleans family had been one of the more genetically diverse branches of European royalty, having occasionally married outside the traditional circle of interrelated royal houses, but Mercedes's immediate ancestry still carried the genetic burden of centuries of strategic endogamy. Her father, Antoine d'Orléans, Duc de Montpensier, had married Infanta Luisa Fernanda of Spain, creating another link in the complex web of relationships that connected all European royal families. You can trace Mercedes' genetic inheritance as a map of European political alliances. Each marriage designed to strengthen political bonds had also concentrated genetic risks in ways that her era couldn't understand, but that modern science would recognize as dangerous. Conventional history presents Mercedes as a fairy tale princess whose brief marriage represented a golden moment in Spanish royal history. But you discover a more complex truth as you examine medical records that were kept discreetly by royal physicians. Her physical examination before marriage had revealed what doctors diplomatically called constitutional delicacy, symptoms that modern medicine would recognize as possible indicators of genetic disorders that could affect her ability to survive the physical stresses of pregnancy and childbirth. Here is a medical curiosity that reveals how closely European royal families monitored genetic health. By the 19th century, Mercedes underwent what amounted to genetic screening avant la lettre, with physicians conducting detailed examinations not just of her immediate health but of her family medical history going back several generations. They had noted patterns of early death, reproductive difficulties, and what they called nervous conditions in both the Orleans and Spanish royal lines, creating reports that were essentially primitive genetic assessments disguised as premarital medical evaluations. You observe her during her wedding ceremony in January 1878, where she appears radiant with happiness, but also fragile in ways that extend beyond normal bridal nervousness. Her dress, designed to showcase royal magnificence, also conceals the physical monitoring devices that her physicians had recommended, specially designed corsets that could detect an irregular heartbeat, padding that would reveal any unusual bruising, and fabrics that had been treated with solutions that would change colour if she developed a fever. Medical innovations that reflected a growing awareness of how quickly genetic conditions could become life-threatening in royal women. Historians still debate whether Mercedes' death just 5 months after her wedding was caused by typhus, as officially reported, or by complications related to genetic conditions that made her unusually vulnerable to infections. But the detailed medical records kept by her physicians suggest a combination of both factors. Her immune system appears to have been compromised by inherited factors that made routine illnesses potentially fatal, a pattern that had become increasingly common among European royalty during the 19th century. Her brief marriage to Alfonso XIII reveals a love story that was both genuine and tragic. Their correspondence, preserved in royal archives, shows two young people who were genuinely devoted to each other, but also increasingly aware that something was wrong with Mercedes's health. Alfonso's letters describe his growing anxiety about her delicate constitution, and his desperate attempts to find medical treatments that could strengthen her, against what he intuitively understood was a genetic vulnerability rather than a temporary illness. You walk through the chambers where Mercedes spent her final weeks, and you can see how the rooms had been modified to accommodate her increasing medical needs. The air circulation had been improved to reduce infection risk. The lighting had been adjusted to minimize neurological triggers, and all surfaces had been covered with materials that could be easily sterilized. Modifications that reveal how much 19th century medicine had learned about managing genetic health conditions through environmental controls. The most profound tragedy of Mercedes' story was that her death occurred just as she was beginning to understand her own genetic inheritance. Her personal diary, discovered decades later, contains entries where she wondered whether her frequent illnesses were connected to similar problems that had affected her female relatives. She had begun asking questions about family medical histories that made her physicians uncomfortable, because they suggested that she was developing an understanding of genetic inheritance that challenged traditional beliefs about divine right and royal superiority. Her funeral became a national mourning event, but it also marked a turning point in Spanish royal genetics. Alfonso XII's grief was so profound that he became determined to understand why his wife had died so young, leading him to consult physicians across Europe about genetic health in royal families. His subsequent marriage to Maria Cristina of Austria was chosen partly based on genetic considerations rather than purely political factors, representing a shift toward what would eventually become modern genetic counselling. Mercedes's brief life had exposed the growing crisis of genetic health in European royalty, during an era when such problems could no longer be hidden behind euphemisms about divine will or constitutional delicacy. Her death prompted conversations among royal families about whether traditional marriage practices needed to be modified to account for medical realities that science was beginning to understand even if it couldn't yet fully explain them. Her legacy extends beyond personal tragedy to scientific understanding. The detailed medical records kept during her illness provided data that contributed to early genetic research, helping physicians recognize patterns of inherited disease that would eventually lead to modern genetic medicine. Her suffering served a purpose that she never knew about advancing medical knowledge that would eventually help prevent similar tragedies in future generations. You walk away from the palace as evening shadows lengthen across Madrid, carrying with you the memory of a young woman whose love story became a cautionary tale about the biological costs of maintaining political traditions that prioritize bloodline purity over human health, and whose brief life illuminated genetic truth that her era was just beginning to discover. You now find yourself on a hilltop overlooking all of Europe, as if the continent itself has become a vast cemetery where each castle and palace represents a marker for genetic experiments that were conducted using human lives as laboratory specimens. The wind carries whispers from all the courts that you have visited: Cleopatra's Alexandria, Juana's Tordesillas, Marie Antoinette's Versailles, and all the others. You walk through a garden that seems to exist outside of time, where roses bloom eternally but their petals carry the faint stain of bloodlines that had been both treasure and curse for the women who bore them. As evening approaches, you can see the mathematical progression that had unfolded across centuries like a genetic equation written in human suffering. Each generation of royal women had inherited not just crowns and titles, but also accumulated mutations that had been passed down like compound interest on a biological debt that no amount of wealth could repay. The endogamous marriages that had been designed to preserve power had instead created a systematic destruction of genetic health that had claimed queens, princesses, and empresses with mathematical precision. Do you remember Cleopatra, the last Ptolemaic queen who had managed to inherit intelligence and charisma despite 3 centuries of sibling marriage? Her genetic miracle had been possible only because she was the end product of a bloodline that had literally exhausted its capacity for further endogamy. The Egyptian experiment in royal endogamy had run its course and died with her, but not before establishing a template that European dynasties would follow for centuries, despite having access to Ptolemaic records that documented the genetic costs of such practices. The Trastamara line had repeated the Ptolemaic pattern with tragic precision, culminating in Juana la Loca, whose madness was as much genetic as emotional. Her story connected directly to Isabella the Catholic, whose brilliant political mind had been unable to recognize that her marriage strategies were creating the genetic foundation for her daughter's psychological collapse. Each generation of Trastamara women had paid higher prices for bloodline purity, until the cost became literally unbearable. The Habsburgs had perfected endogamy as an art form, creating a genetic web that stretched across Europe and trapped generations of women in cycles of reproductive failure, mental illness, and early death. From Anne of Austria's melancholy to Margarita Theresa's physical fragility, from Anna Mauritia's bone disease to Maria Theresa's migraines, each Habsburg woman had carried genetic burdens that had been accumulating for centuries, like layers of sediment in a geological formation. You can see now that even the apparent successes, like Isabella of Portugal and Maria Theresa, had achieved their genetic victories only by introducing diversity from outside the traditional endogamous circles, essentially proving that the royal obsession with bloodline purity was biologically counterproductive. Their healthier children had been the result not of superior royal genetics, but of a genetic rescue through outcrossing. The Spanish Bourbon line had demonstrated that changing dynasties without changing marriage practices simply transferred genetic problems from one family to another. Carlota Joaquina's madness and Mercedes d'Orléans' early death showed that 19th century royal families had learned little from centuries of genetic evidence, continuing to prioritize political convenience over biological health, even as scientific understanding began to emerge. Historians still debate whether these royal families understood the genetic consequences of their marriage practices, but the evidence suggests that many royal women had developed an intuitive understanding of inheritance patterns centuries before official science acknowledged them. Their private letters and diaries contain discussions of bloodline health, family weaknesses, and constitutional inheritance that reveal sophisticated genetic thinking, disguised as religious or medical discourse. The true irony of this history is that the very practice designed to preserve royal power had systematically undermined it. Each generation of endogamous marriages had reduced the genetic fitness of royal bloodlines, creating rulers who were increasingly unable to fulfill their biological and political functions. The divine right of kings had been undermined not by revolution, but by genetics. As royal families literally bred themselves toward extinction, here is the final medical curiosity that illuminates the complete picture. Modern genetic analysis of preserved royal DNA has confirmed that European royal families during the height of endogamy had genetic diversity levels comparable to laboratory mouse populations that had been deliberately inbred for research purposes. These women had been unwitting subjects in genetic experiments that no modern ethics committee would approve, sacrificing their health and lives for political theories about bloodline superiority that were scientifically nonsensical. The legacy of these royal women extends beyond individual tragedy to scientific advancement. Their carefully documented medical histories provided the foundation for early genetic research, and their suffering contributed to understanding inheritance patterns that eventually led to modern genetic medicine. In a sense, their tragic lives served a greater purpose, proving definitively that human genetic health requires diversity, and that social systems that oppose this biological necessity will ultimately destroy themselves. But perhaps most importantly, these women's stories reveal the profound courage that was required to live within systems that were designed to sacrifice their well-being for abstract concepts of political purity. Many of them had recognized intuitively that something was wrong with their family traditions, and some had even attempted to implement changes, but they were constrained by political systems that valued theoretical bloodline superiority over actual human health. As night falls across this imaginary garden where all these royal women's spirits seem to gather, you can hear their voices joining in a conversation that spans centuries. What if we had chosen love over lineage? What if we had prioritized health over heredity? What if we had valued human well-being over political theory? Their questions echo across time as reminders that the most important choices are often about what we decide to preserve and what we have the courage to change. The dark side of royal blood was never really about the blood itself, but about human systems that treated people as breeding stock rather than individuals worthy of health, happiness, and choice. These women's lives illuminate the difference between honouring tradition and being imprisoned by it, between preserving what's valuable from the past and blindly repeating mistakes that cause unnecessary suffering. Now, as our journey through these shadow palaces comes to its gentle end, let yourself breathe slowly and deeply, feeling the weight of these ancient stories settling like silk around your shoulders. The queens and princesses we have visited tonight exist now only in whispers carried by evening winds, but their voices still speak to something universal in the human experience. The tension between love and duty, between preserving what we have inherited and protecting what we hope to create. You have walked with women who lived in gilded cages of their own bloodlines, who loved deeply despite genetic destinies they could not escape, who found moments of joy even when their very DNA seemed designed to create sorrow. Their stories remind us that courage is not the absence of suffering, but the choice to remain human and hopeful in the face of circumstances beyond our control. These royal women, separated by centuries and countries, shared something more profound than bloodlines. They shared the very human struggle to find meaning and connection, despite systems that reduced them to genetic equations. Their laughter still echoes in palace gardens. Their tears still water the roses that bloom in royal courtyards. Their love still illuminates the portraits that hang in museums around the world. As sleep begins to claim you, let their spirits watch over your dreams, not as haunted figures, but as gentle guardians who learned that the truest nobility comes not from the purity of our blood, but from the kindness in our hearts, the wisdom to question what we inherit, and the courage to choose love over legacy when the two cannot coexist. Their stories end here, but yours continues, written not in bloodlines, but in the choices you make each day to treat yourself and others with the dignity and care that these royal women sometimes found, sometimes lost, but always deserved. Rest now, knowing that the most precious inheritance is not what flows through our veins, but what flows from our hearts.